So, you've picked this lab because you think this is going to be the best lab ever. You're going to make your own hooch, aka moonshine. Here's the letdown though. The bummer. This is probably the one of the most boring labs that you will do this semester. Yeah, there's not too much to this one. Actually, you're going to have to walk away from this one for about a week before you can do anything to it. So as far as the setups go, nothing really special is going to happen here. As far as the process goes, nothing advanced is going to happen here. However, we do incorporate some more advanced type of testing techniques at the end of the laboratory, but to actually make the moonshine, it's pretty easy to do. Now, the thing here is that you are going to be making moonshine, and you might say, well, this is illegal, but it's not. We're in an academic setting, and you're actually going to end up with a very small amount. And that very small amount is not enough to make it illegal. So, like before with all the other labs, we're going to talk a little bit of background about moonshine or ethanol, and we're going to talk about the good things and the bad things and some of the common problems that you might see with them. And then we'll go in and we'll talk about the lab setup and the lab process. All right, so like I said just a few seconds ago, moonshine or alcohol or ethanol, that's what moonshine actually is, it is illegal. And you're probably saying, well, why is it illegal? And that's because they don't want you to be making it at home and selling it to take sales away from the ABC stores. Pretty much that's kind of what it boils down to. It is a very high-proof liquor. And if you don't want to use the term liquor and you want to be fancy, you can also use the term spirit. High proof means that it has a very high alcohol content. The highest alcohol content that it can go to is 100% alcohol, which is 200 proof. Now, where did the term moonshiner come from? Moonshiner, moon means dark and night, and that's when most of the shiners did their work at night. So people couldn't see them going out into the middle of the woods and making their own alcohol. So they hid away from the cops, and they hid away from their friends, and they hid away from their buddies, and they secretly went up into the woods to make this stuff. So that's where the term moonshiner comes from. And bootlegger is also another term that's used to describe these people. But bootlegger is actually the person that began to transport the moonshine back in the day. So the moonshiners would make the moonshine, who would then give it to the bootlegger. And the bootlegger would load up all of these barrels and these containers and the whiskey jugs into their horse and buggy or cart or car. And off they went. Now, out of all the areas of the United States, the Appalachian region was the most famous for their moonshine. The original recipe came from the Scots-Irish, and it was titled the Water of Life. So your vision of people running around with no shoes and overalls and straw hats with a piece of straw out of their mouth, hiding up into the middle of the woods where no one could see them to make the moonshine, those are the people that you can thank for allowing other people to get drunk. Well, those recipes had to come from somewhere, and people had to learn how to make it from some person who had done it before, and most of those techniques and processes came from the Scots-Irish. So if you ever see an Irish person, maybe someone with red hair, thank them, because their heritage basically brought us moonshine. What they decided to do is wagons could make more money if it was full of moonshine jugs instead of corn. So that's why the bootleggers became very common. You made more money at it. So why not? It's all about money. More money, you can buy things to make you happy. So that's why they decided to do it. And one of the most famous moonshiners that are out there in the day was called Marvin Popcorn Sutton, or Popcorn. And he was from North Carolina. So thank you, North Carolina, for giving us Popcorn Sutton because he made some of the best moonshine around. The problem is that Popcorn began to outrun the laws and nobody could catch him basically making the moonshine. And he started making these documentaries and videos of him in the process of making it and explaining to someone the tips and tricks of the trade. And then they finally caught up to Mr. Popcorn and they basically sentenced him to prison. Well, before the prison sentence began, Mr. Popcorn committed suicide. He didn't want to go to prison, so he killed himself. And it was by carbon monoxide poisoning. So he basically sucked in the exhaust of his tailpipe, and away he went to sleep. Moonshine in the ABC store, keep in mind, is not really moonshine. It just uses the name. That's all it does. They lied to you. Moonshine is as close to 100% as it can get, meaning as close to 200 proof. And if you take a look at the labels that say moonshine on the ABC store, no, it's not really moonshine. It's kind of like the name of the company that's producing that alcohol, and there's nothing moonshine related about it. So they're lying to you. It is not moonshine, and it would not be moonshine unless it would have the very high percentage of alcohol. There's a link here. That link, if you click it, will take you and show you a little bit of Popcorn up in the woods making his own thing. And here is Mr. Popcorn in the front in his overalls. So, of course, he had some friends and some buddies to help him out. He taught them the tricks of the trade, how to make the best moonshine around. And there you go. That's basically how it was done back in the day. So what you're getting ready to do is to do what Popcorn did and make moonshine. And that requires a little bit of fermentation process and some distillation. And if you take a look at the barrels and stuff that are around Popcorn, that's basically what these barrels and this tubing's for. So you're going to have a container, and that container is going to have what we would call your mash, and that mash is going to have to ferment. You're going to have to kind of leave it sit for a couple of days at least until all of it begins to ferment and all the yeast breaks down the sugar. When that begins to happen, it is ready to distill. You need to get the alcohol out of the mash, and you need to capture the alcohol in its purity in a collection container. And basically, that's what the copper tubing's for. The copper tubing's going to help you evaporate the alcohol, or help him evaporate the alcohol out of the mash and collect it and condense it down. Well, if you're evaporating something, you probably need a heat source. So very often you would see these big ovens or these heat sources that they would kindle fire in to heat this stuff up and to boil it over. So there's your kind of moonshine. And if you took a look at the cartoon up here at the top, that cartoon is your typical hillbilly. That's what you most of the time see when you think of Appalachian Mountains. Well, that image is depicted from Mr. Popcorn, which is right here in the center of the picture. So that's representative of the Appalachian culture. And of course, here with the triple X's, that's the moonshine jug. That's what you want to stay away from, or maybe that's what you want, depending on who you are. So moonshine is always for sale. In the Appalachian Mountains, it seems like homemade moonshine for sale, not for sale, for sale. And it says free sample this way. Call Bill Jones. Sold. Don't tell the police. Police. I hope this is actually a joke, but coming from the Appalachian Mountains myself, I can kind of almost guarantee that this probably isn't a joke. This is kind of common. All right, so if you want to go to the YouTube video and watch a little bit about Popcorn and basically allow him to tell you how this process got started, you're more than welcome to go to that link, and that link is going to be in Blackboard for you. So you can click that link, watch that video, and kind of review all the tidbits of info that comes from Popcorn's mouth. These techniques, maybe you can implement in the lab, depending on what he decides to tell you, because you're basically going to be doing the same thing. The issue with moonshine, there's always a health hazard associated with it. You're relying on someone to do the distillation for you. And this distillation, if it's not done the proper way, well, you can get contamination. And that contamination can cause people to go blind. What is basically the contamination? The contamination here is methanol, methanol. Methanol is the one that you've got to watch out for. Methanol is a very common solvent that's used in our laboratory. You will be using methanol all the time. It's a very good cleaner. It's a very good solvent. We find it in wash bottles, and it's full in our refrigerator. The problem is that methanol in very high doses can cause some health concerns, and one of which, it can make you go blind. So if you decide to drink moonshine that has not been distilled properly, and that moonshine has methanol in it, then that methanol will cause you to go to the hospital. So that's basically the risk that you're taking if you do take moonshine from someone that you do not know. Well, the problem here is that not only that, but many of the stills use metal piping. And that metal piping can be made from radiator parts that also contain glycol and antifreeze, as well as lead. So if they do distill it the proper way and you do not get any methanol at all into your sample, the next issue is, what did they use to distill it? And if they are using these used metal parts in the distillation setup, then you're going to get contamination from that. So if you're watching this, you're probably very familiar with Gen-X in the Cape Fear River. And Gen-X would be the last thing that you would need to worry about if you're drinking moonshine from someone else. Traces of acetone and traces of aldehydes can also be found in the product. These can also be very poisonous to you. And solutions with concentrations more than 50% of alcohol are very flammable. So, moonshine you can catch on fire. It can be explosive. It is a very flammable liquid. So again, there's a video here. This video will take you to a YouTube description of ethanol and the distillation process and the side effects of drinking too much moonshine or contaminated moonshine. And I would encourage you to watch that video before you attempt the pre-lab quiz. All right. So I said that moonshine can be caught on fire, right? And that's one of the tests that they decide to do. So many tests are performed by the Appalachian people to determine the purity and the strength of the moonshine that they make. Now, keep in mind that we're a laboratory. You're a laboratory technician. You will be able to go into a lab and use fancy equipment to determine if moonshine is contaminated or not. But this is not available to Popcorn out into the middle of the woods, and he's got to have a way to prove the purity of it that's very simple and very easy to do without the need of equipment and without the need for a laboratory. So number one, you shake it. That's all that you got to do. And if you shake the moonshine samples, large bubbles with very short duration times means that this is a very high alcohol content. That means your proof is really, really good. It's close to 200 or at least very high. So you take the sample, shake it up in a jar, and if you see really big bubbles and they don't stay around very long, then that is a very good sample of moonshine. If you shake the sample and they're really tiny little bitty bubbles and they stay in the solution for quite some time, that means that you've got a lot of water in the sample, and that water is lowering the proof and it's lowering the percentage of alcohol, and maybe it's not going to be as potent as what you would like. Number two, you light it. So back in the day, people would pour a little bit of moonshine into a spoon, and they would take a lighter and they would light that sample up and set it on fire. If it went blue, that's pure alcohol. If it went yellow, that is impure alcohol. And if it's red, it makes you dead. That is a sign that lead is in contamination. So just keep that in mind. If you are getting moonshine, and I hope that you're not, but if you are getting moonshine from someone and you put a flame to it, if it goes red, you're dead. So do not drink it. Send it back and get a refund. Number 3, use a hydrometer. So a hydrometer is a tool that's very commonly obtained. No laboratory space is required or needed. No fancy equipment is needed. Yeah, it's a little bit more expensive, but if you're doing this as a living, and a hydrometer is going to make your life a little bit better. They use hydrometers in beer making. They use hydrometers in wine making. They use hydrometers in moonshine making as well. It's all alcohol related, people. So there's 2 videos that are there that you're seeing on your screen, and those videos will also be available in the Blackboard site. So make sure that you click them, watch the guy use a hydrometer and explain how a hydrometer is used to make sure that these samples are pure and clean. Okay? So in the next video, we're going to talk about the distillation, because cotton's distillation, popcorn, and your distillation is going to be very similar. All the pieces and parts are going to be there. They're just going to look a little different because you're in a nice little clean lab that uses glassware, and his is not. His is in the middle of the woods using barrels and copper tubing. So we'll talk about the distillation. We'll talk about the process of how this thing works and why it works the way that it does. So come back for the next video and then watch all of these extra YouTube videos at the very end.